I've just been at the beach. I live quite close to the beach here, and I spent a couple of hours down there, and it's we're in the depths of our winter here, and of course, it's a milder affair than in other parts of the world. But I was still struck to see some bikini-clad ladies enjoying the sun. So it's yeah, life
Well,
can
one of
be. Go ahead.
well, one of my bitterest regrets of being in Italy is the discovery that in Italy there is not a lot of topless sunbathing. You have this idea of the Mediterranean being an all-encompassing topless culture, but it turns out that's only Spain.
Yeah.
In Italy, they're way too conservative. In fact, if in the unlikely occasion where an Italian woman wants to sunbathe topless, she'll actually go to a different village to make sure she's not known.
I see.
Yeah, but even that is too rare to be counted on.
And this is the sort of knowledge I need. I mean, not. And for what it's worth, the Australians, for all their hedonism, are remarkably prudish on the beach. You will see toplessness once in a blue moon, very rarely. It's just not done. And but apparently that's a change over the last 20-25 years. So my older colleagues, I had an older colleague tell me, recounted the delightful anecdote when he was part of some university society or another. And they went down to the beach, and he remembers catching sight of a dozen or so of his fellow society members, the female ones, all topless, lined up in the beach, and that's something you don't see now,
Well,
unless you unless you
you
have a
know what's lame
smartphone.
about that?
Well, a lot of things,
Well, it's
capitalism,
American imperialism.
of
That's to blame.
course.
Well, no, I think there's some ground for that. I've been told that even in the Netherlands now, topless sunbathing, which has been going on for ages, is now becoming passé, and it's precisely because of this sort of American cultural influence. Now, that to me, that's just the worst kind of crime. That's an outrage.
Well, I can I can compound your outrage by telling you it's even in Sweden. All forms of toplessness and nudity is right in retreat, very much right in retreat.
Wow.
Well, and apparently the source is women of this generation have more complexes about their body image, which of course I can only assume has been generated by their imbibing copious amounts of American cultural product, which gives them an idea of what an attractive body image is, or what an attractive body is. So,
Well, this to me is just an outright outrage. I mean, 2 million dead in Iraq, that's one thing. That's regrettable. But if
yeah,
toplessness around the world at the beach is in retreat, as you say, on account of this pernicious American cultural media influence, I mean, somebody needs to do something.
yeah. Unfortunately, it's one of those things you can get a lot of people behind. It's one of those great causes you get a lot of people behind, but I just can't see it getting off the ground anytime soon. One of the jobs that I did go for here when I moved to the city was you have attached to each the local governmental unit here is city, even though it's essentially what you call a district. That attached to each district are usually a couple of what are called rangers, and their job is it's a sort of an all-encompassing. If a tree falls down, you break it up, you cut it up. If there's snakes in a garden, you go get them. This sort of thing. It's an all in, and this is my attraction to this kind of role came from having worked in an office environment in Sydney, a corporate environment, and I had enough of this. I want to try something completely different. And I remember talking to somebody who did this in a particular district here in Perth, and he said, like honestly, a large part of my job is checking the beaches for topless bathing. and if I find it, I have to stop it. So of
Oh my
course,
God.
yeah, and of course that cued an enormous amount of laughter, and he said, "Yeah, it's a tough job, but someone has to do it." Was his take on things. But yeah, it's I mean, it's also against the law here. Should be borne in mind, and Australians are fiercely law-abiding. So once the law says something, well, behavior follows.
Well, I mean, if there's not going to be a revolution on account of topless sunbathing being oppressed and repressed and prohibited, then I don't know what it would take.
Yeah. Well, I see. The I was just following my last phone call. This murder of 40 tourists in Tunisia or something,
I
beheading in
saw the
France.
headline, but
Christ.
omitted to investigate.
Wow. Yeah. Well, listen. On a more serious note, I remember previously we had an exchange via email, and it was on. I suppose the theme became why mainstream philosophy rejects mysticism, to put it as simple as possible. And I think that's something worth discussing, particularly in light of previous discussions, where we thought that the UFO subject has a great deal to do with spirituality, and there's this seemingly great relationship between the experience of alien craft, or seeing something, and spiritual development and meditative practice. So I suppose what might be a good start is to really, if you want to just speak on that.
Well, I can think of a few different ways to come at it. The first is the very powerful relation in Western philosophy with the concept of demonstration. If you look at what makes Western philosophy what it is, to the extent that it's one thing at all that can be discussed, if we accept that its origins more or less are in ancient Greece, and we look at what we know of its development in ancient Greece, in my opinion, what makes it become what it is this, I mean, to be as simplistic about as possible, Western philosophy comes out of Pythagoras. In other words, it's the intersection between a certain kind of cultural wisdom tradition and mathematical formalism. There are plenty of world cultures where there are wisdom traditions, and in the Near East, you had, Buddhism already beginning to flower, and there's a lot to be said for the origins of Western philosophy and Buddhism. No one wants to discuss that because they consider the two areas distinct. But the reason why Greek philosophy becomes what it does, I think, is its attempt to view the mathematical in terms of the metaphysical. In fact, you could say that metaphysics itself, ultimately, in its origins and maybe in its entire history, is nothing more than an attempt to mythologize the mathematical. Well, what does all this mean? Well, it means that mathematical demonstration sort of colonizes and infects these wisdom traditions and becomes Western philosophy, to the point where later on you have, if you look at Western philosophy in Europe post 1500, the great philosophers again and again for a certain period of time are mathematicians, or they employ mathematical or geometrical style proofs, whether it's Pascal or Descartes, Spinoza. It goes on and on and on. And even the philosophers who aren't mathematicians per se, they nonetheless become philosophers in the midst of this winding discourse that's so heavily influenced by mathematics, logic, and therefore a commitment to demonstration, overt demonstration. I think if there's an antipathy to mysticism in Western philosophy, the main reason owes to this commitment to demonstration. And that simply has to do with its historical development. Now, obviously, in ancient Greece, to say that philosophy was simply this kind of formal application of mathematical logic would be to overstate it, because all of the tendencies were in play. I mean, you've got Socrates hearing his inner voice, and you have all the the Delphic oracular influence, and so really Greek philosophy taken in total was very much a set of mystical doctrines. But out of Greece, once it leaves out of Greece, already into the Stoic period, where you have this almost a demythological tendency, retaining the Stoic logic, but getting rid of the retaining the more formal logical dimension, but getting rid of the more overt Greek, what we would call the mythological dimension. That's sort of already where the trajectory of Western philosophy takes off. So that's one reason why there's a rejection of the mystical. Now, if you look specifically at the 20th century, you have a bunch of reasons that are easily detectable, but I mean, one of them is obviously that philosophy in the 20th century is now basically an academic practice, just like so many other so-called disciplines. It's, academics writing journal articles for other academics, and the slightly more talented or successful among them will write books that are really nothing more than academic productions. So in that regard, they're definitely going to avoid mysticism for the most part. I mean, they may import it as a set of thematics. You'll have this or that philosopher who decides to distinguish himself by including aspects of the mystical, but you never really have the mystical as such appearing in the lives of bona fide philosophers in the 20th century in any kind of important way.
Well, one thing that seems clear is that in the French tradition, at least, there's an ongoing concern for a sense that philosophy and reason can alleviate the suffering of man, can lead to his sort of development or liberation, if you like. I think that's a reasonable take on what is occurring there, and that goes as far right up to the modern, up until the contemporary scene. And what I wonder, what I don't understand is, looking at that, you have a body, an academic body, obviously, includes very intelligent and educated people who are directed towards a certain goal. Yet, alongside them is another group who claim for themselves a similar orientation of liberation and freeing of human beings. Yet there doesn't seem to be any particular exchange between both groups. Now, earlier you mentioned this issue of demonstration. Within the various mystical traditions, or the Eastern religions, they would claim that their transmission, their survival, and their lineages are based on a demonstration. They can demonstrate these states of enlightenment, and they can point to a series of practices that, if they're followed, then those states can be, realized by whomever so wishes. Having said that, that does not seem to have impressed, if you like, say French thought in the last century. I mean, that's a large claim, but it's not seen. It's at no point has there been any serious French intellectual, for instance, a French philosopher, has said that the French Republic now requires its citizenry to engage in meditation. We need to commit ourselves to developing this aspect of our consciousness. Although from the very beginning of its existence, the French Republic has always included the idea that, or integral to the idea of the French Republic, is that it is an evolving form that requires ever more developed reason, and that will develop an ever more sophisticated republic, ever more reflective of the virtues and possibilities of man. But as I said, you don't see this. As far as I can see from my very limited survey, there really is no call for this transformation of man via particular traditions. And I wonder why that is the case.
Well, I'm sure you can imagine. I mean, why does one set of cultural traditions gain favor in a given country and not another set? There are all sorts of kind of obvious reasons, if something is specifically French or has a specifically French origin, it's bound to have something that, it's bound to gain more notice, recognition, and perhaps more influence in a country like France than otherwise. And these cultural traditions of mysticism that involve transmission that you mentioned, they are at bottom simply different cultural traditions. I mean, there's a reason why the French don't, the French Republic doesn't call on the French people to, live an Amish way of life. Or, because it's simply too much distance between them. However, I would say that on the point of transmission versus demonstration, I would say that naturally each is more or less a comment on the social practice at the time. In other words, if you have a cultural tradition that implicitly or explicitly calls for the supremacy of demonstration, well, that's because that's their favorite mode already. Likewise, if you have a cultural tradition that advocates for the supremacy of transmission, person-to-person transmission, that's a statement ultimately on another kind of social practice. So each form is going to favor tendencies already within it. It's no surprise then that Western philosophy, European philosophy, would be resistant or ignorant, resistant to or ignorant of more Eastern traditions that favor transmission, and vice versa.
But at the same time, though, if you look within that tradition, I mean, there's been an ongoing assault, if you like, on traditional religious practices and the traditional spiritual beliefs as part of an overall secular drive. Now, that secular drive, in and of itself, claims for itself it's driven by a seasoned rationality. And it's still, you would think, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that as part of that there would be at least an exploration of different claims for liberation and transformation. That seems to be an ongoing concern of socially concerned philosophy. It still seems strange that it's not made any particular impact on, social thought at large.
Well, when I consider the general reception toward Buddhism or Hinduism or other cultural traditions that don't exclude what we would call mystical experiences, I find that the reception, to the extent that it exists, is mostly one of indifference. And the reason why, of course, is because the issue of reception itself is basically a political one. whom do we recognize and whom do we not recognize, these decisions are never based simply on the content offered by this or that tradition alone. It's always a sort of politicized issue. What drives one cultural tradition to resist itself and to recognize anything other or outer to it? Well, this is something that you only see really in the 20th century to begin with, when you have this sort of wild counter-tradition in so many different spheres. But naturally, the principles or the rationales that these counter-traditions give are not identical to what they really are. So if, let's say, you have a French intellectual tradition that tries to throw off an older, earlier tradition, whether it's a broader cultural tradition or a more specific intellectual tradition, it's not simply to throw it off and to replace it with something else that they behave the way that they do. There are all sorts of implicit assumptions and things that they're trying to achieve that aren't spoken, maybe aren't even entirely conscious. And it's with those things that some other outer tradition has to be consistent for it to be recognized and entertained or incorporated. So if you have some sort of Western counter impulse and a desire to throw off more traditional forms, there are still all sorts of unwritten rules about what they're looking for to achieve that end. And if some other cultural tradition doesn't offer certain things, it won't even be entertained.
So ultimately, by that account, there is no proper rational inquiry ongoing within French philosophy or general Western social thought, that it is very bounded by political concerns and various cultural limitations, that when there is consideration of the possibilities for the transformation of citizens within a social order, that consideration occurs down very well-defined channels, which by their nature define any acceptance or inclusion of, sort of the thoughts and traditions I'd mentioned, such as Buddhism or Hinduism or even Western mystical traditions.
Sure, I think, if you're going to frame it as you are in a sort of political way, for this or that country to the relationship between a state, for example, and the population and so on, that's always going to be a very temporary and historically contingent issue. If you look at it more broadly, if you want to just talk about, for example, the way mystical experience has been handled in the West and is handled today, I think the story there is fairly well known. I think that owing to the accidental development of Christianity in the heart of the falling Roman Empire, in other words, the Christianity essentially grew to fill the place of the Roman Empire using most of the same forms and so on. Because Christianity was just another form of the Roman state, it had to stamp out what it called heresies fairly early on. And as I understand it, in the original Greek, I believe, heresy simply means school of thought. Of course, it's interesting, today we understand heresy to mean evil doctrine. But the original Catholic Church fathers, so-called, who were trying to stamp out heresies, were doing so precisely because they wanted to found a universal church. The word Catholic is supposed to mean universal. Now, why this particular preoccupation with universality? Well, I think mainly because of the historical accident of developing into the framework left behind by Roman power.
Of becoming a
So,
state religion.
yeah, and becoming a state, really. You had a theocracy is what you had. As the Roman Empire sort of faded, every step back of the Roman Empire was a step forward for Christianity. Which is not to say that the Roman Empire was replaced by something totally different. No, Christianity, as we understand it, the Catholic Church and all of that, basically was the Roman Empire in a new form. The imperial purple of the Roman emperor became the purple of the Pope. And in so many ways, the papacy and the Catholic Church and so on, it was defined itself in the same terms of Roman power. So you had this historical set of events in the early centuries of the first millennium in which, in order to become universal, which is to say, in order to become the Roman Empire, Christianity had to stamp out these other schools, which, if it weren't for that occurrence, if it weren't for this framework of the Roman Empire that the Christian church, for whatever reason, was drawn inexorably to fill, this vacuum that it was to fill. In other places around the world where you have all these different schools, and you always do, you always have faction and warring doctrines and so on, you might have had conflict and schools opposing each other. I'm sure you had in Buddhism. I'm sure you had Buddhists killing each other over doctrines all the time. But the idea that one had to be universal per se, with all of the implicit meaning that was imported into that concept by the pre-existent fact of there being a Roman Empire, that was unique. And so not only did you have to stamp out these other schools in the pursuit of universality, but you had this construction of the evil doctrine, that these were not simply other schools that are in the way, but they are also evil. And that at the same time fed into this concept of the demonic. There are many books written on this. I mean, you can look at the construction of Satan, the development of the figure of Satan from early Judaism up through Christianity. In the remote past, Satan, or Ha-Satan, however it was pronounced, the Satan, the adversary, it was a title. One of God's lieutenants who his formal role in this sort of heavenly order was to prosecute, to accuse, to slander. So in the book of Job, for example, if Job is regarded as a righteous man, Ha-Satan would say, no, not so fast, and then say, no, he's only a righteous man because he's been so fortunate. Let's remove all of his good fortune, his home, his wealth, his health, and everything else, and let's see if he's still a believer and so on. So that was the role of Satan. But once it gets to Christianity, combined with all sorts of Hellenic notions of the daimon, or the genius, the spirit inside of this person or inside of this minor deity, and also thanks to Zoroastrianism, which is another influence, which held that there was this cosmic struggle between good and evil. Now you have this figure of Satan emerge, who is the embodiment of evil and who's almost as powerful as God. Maybe not quite as powerful, but almost. So it's like it's an almost Zoroastrianism that gets imported into Christianity, becomes Christianity. And so then you have the relentless persecution of all of these other sects, these doctrines throughout Western history as being evil, as being satanically motivated. And finally, to get to the end here where we talk about mysticism, Christianity itself came to regard, for the most part, mystical experience as, by definition, an experience of the demonic. Up to the present day, if you look at Christian fundamentalism. And there was There's a pair of researchers, self-identified researchers in the Midwest of the U.S. who supposedly have done scientific experiments on the efficacy of prayer. In other words, they've done all sorts of studies, again, supposing that they're legitimate, on the growth of plants as influenced by prayer, and all sorts of mundane things, and whether prayer has a direct physical effect. And according to them, I've heard a few interviews, according to them, they find, yes, prayer does have a demonstrable statistical effect on this, that, and the other thing. But the interesting thing about what they said to me was that whenever they would present their results to Christian fundamentalists, whom you think would be overjoyed at real-world confirmation of their own belief, because again, these are the same people who insist that the world was created 6,000 years ago, that dinosaur bones left behind are tests of our faith, and maybe even seeded by Satan himself. And they want to insist on the literality of the Bible, for example. These people were absolutely horrified and violently opposed the results of the research that prayer had any kind of real effect, and they condemned it as black magic, as satanic. How can that be? Well, there you see.
I have a little experience of that. I can only remember one time I've read a book and actually been frightened. I mean, literally frightened to the point where I had difficulty sleeping. And that was Hostage to the Devil by Malachi Martin. And it is an account of the rite of exorcism. Now, in time, I can have a different view of things. But what he, of course, presents are a number of case studies where the rite of exorcism was performed. And of course, it involves the nature of the possession, the nature of the demons involved, the clash with a satanic presence. And these case studies are prefaced and summarized with a number of very interesting essays. But the reason the book frightened me was it very much made alive to me the possibility that there is a transcendent good and evil, which meant that I lacked the moral autonomy that I thought I enjoyed. In other words, it's not actually bullshit. There could be some truth to this, which then meant I feared for myself. And I think too that with Christian fundamentalists, and they hear of something of prayer, they vicariously indulge certain tendencies of thought. And then when they're confronted by something like this, they discover, it's as if they're discovering that this actually has a significance that implies that their hypocrisies will have very real impact on their own lives.
Well, you could well be right. And I would say that, like you, my own encounters in the literature and listening to interviews and so on, with the prospect that there could be this kind of transcendent good and evil, it provokes the same reaction. Not only for fear of my own sins having something like a classically horrible and dooming effect on my soul, but perhaps more because of the type of powerlessness. So in line to a certain extent with issues of autonomy, but the idea straight out of all of the classic cultural literature about good and evil, the fact that you might be simply completely powerless, that's a horrifying thought. But second, I would say that there are other ways, in addition to what you say, to understand the fundamentalist rejection of the reality, the physical reality of prayer. And this gives the opportunity to bring in Lacan a little bit. In Lacanian psychoanalysis, all of these cultural forms and so on are different ways of organizing your enjoyment. And of course, your enjoyment, your deep unconscious satisfaction is sustained by a basic lack, a deprivation. So in order for you to enjoy the thing, you have to be deprived of the thing, perhaps counterintuitively. And you see this all the time with people who, well, in the classic romantic situation, someone has a terrible crush on the other person. Maybe he builds her up in his mind, this fantasy object and so on. And when people say, well, why don't you go talk to her? Why don't you ask her out? Oh, no, 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 no. And it becomes, in the end, obvious that if he did talk to her or enter into a relationship with her, it would destroy this fantasy object he's created. So he's organized a system of enjoyment around this basic lack, which is filled out by this fantasy experience. Well, when it comes to the fundamentalism and its abhorrence of the physical reality or confirmation of its own doctrine, you see something similar. I think you could say that these people have so organized their own titillation that the actual reality of what they supposedly believe has to be excluded, because if it isn't, then all of a sudden the whole structure of enjoyment caves in. And we see this in at least two other places as regards the so-called paranormal. It's quite interesting, and it's always amused me. First, this visceral resistance by fans and authors of science fiction to the UFO issue. It's fantastic to observe, because you would think on its face that an interest in UFOs would be completely consistent with the basic enjoyment of the science fiction fan, right? If you're interested in science fiction, you're interested in fantastic scenarios, wondrous prospects. You're obviously interested in extraterrestrial life. And you've got 100 million science fiction stories that involve UFOs, extraterrestrials. I mean, that's the basis of science fiction. But the suggestion that it might exist, that the UFO issue might have some physical reality to it, appalls them. They have to reject it out of hand. I've seen it again and again and again. Why is that? Well, there you have the reason. It has to be fake for them to enjoy it. This is the way that their system of enjoyment is structured. Number two, again, the exact same thing. Who are the people who most consistently come out to debunk psychic powers? Magicians, stage magicians, douchebags like the so-called Amazing Randy, these assholes Penn and Teller with their television show. Again and again and again, it's magicians who come out and debunk this stuff. Why? Well, you might take a sort of preliminary step and say, well, it's because these guys, they have a knowledge of how tricks are done, therefore they try to apply their knowledge. I don't think it's that simple at all. I think these guys have an internal resistance and an abhorrence at the idea that the paranormal, that psychic powers might be real. Why? Because their whole lifelong pursuit of this enjoyment of stage magic is based on the exclusion of the possibility that any of it could be real. I mean, the satisfaction you get at being able to make someone think something is real when it's fake, when you know it's fake, the feeling of mastery that comes with this knowledge that you have achieved something difficult, you alone know how it's done, they don't. The fact that you are in this little social circle of other magicians who know a lot of tricks, but I mean, there's the professional satisfaction of having a new trick that they don't know. All of this hinges on psychic abilities, magical abilities, not existing in actual fact. So it's their enjoyment, it's their satisfaction that's threatened in each case. It's the satisfaction that's threatened by something being almost completely identical, but differing in some crucial, fundamental respect, and your entire system of enjoyment being threatened by it. I mean, I think fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, would basically cease to be an enjoyable doctrine, an enjoyable social enterprise and experience if all of a sudden all of this stuff became physically real.
But then can't you say the same for mainstream science's rejection of the possibility of UFOs and ETs? Isn't that part of it? When you apply sort of same argument there, that for academic scientists, journalists and the like, if this were then to be proven to be the case, then their own internal satisfactions from a sense of mastery, of discipline or a knowledge would be removed, and which would then in turn, I assume, make them constitutionally incapable of accepting that possibility.
Well, yes. Well, I mean, broadly speaking, the system of satisfactions that they derive and the whole set of social relations so on would be threatened. It's slightly different in that I would say in the cases of Christian fundamentalism, science fiction, and stage magic and so on, these social enterprises are structured around something very specific. So, for example, with Christian fundamentalism, let's say we're talking about prayer as a specific kind of practice. With science fiction, we're talking about imagining fantastic scenarios and writing about them. And when it comes to stage magic, you can easily imagine, and some of it I just described, the creation of the trick and everything that's attached to it. I think that in those three cases, the practice would evaporate if the physical reality of these slightly different others became predominant. I think the practice would evaporate. I mean, if all of a sudden aliens started appearing in the skies, I don't think that the production of science fiction would survive in a certain sense, because it's already happening. Why would you read about some bullshit fake sci-fi scenario if there's a real one unfolding all around you? Now, when it comes to science, physical science, I think the satisfaction of individual scientists would definitely be threatened. It goes without saying that today's scientists in the culture of science with a capital S, these individual scientists have a whole framework of satisfactions. No matter what they say, they enjoy what they perceive to be their position of supremacy in relation to everybody else, the position of authority. I think that even if they are individually shaken, I think the scientific method as a practice would continue to be viable, because the practice itself is sufficiently distinct that, if UFOs started showing up in such numbers, and it's undeniable, they might nonetheless use the scientific method to learn more, even though the whole social practice of being a quote-unquote scientist might be out the window. The method itself would kind of inhere.
Well, then isn't that coming up against an argument repeated for many years now by Strieber, that our science would become, our culture would become as say Samoa. I think this is the example he gives, as American Samoa, that that Pacific Island culture in contact with an alien civilization, i.e. the West, it sort of imploded in on itself. Its internal dynamism was completely undone, and it lost all capacity for innovation, invention, study, and the like. That's often seemed to me to be quite a lurid and unlikely scenario.
Yeah, I'm with you. As a possible explanation for the theater in the sky and for the secrecy and so on, that is certainly a workable one. It's very plausible that if there was suddenly an undeniable overt extraterrestrial presence that overwhelmed us in every sphere, that we would be overwhelmed in every sphere, and that we would cease to be viable. If you look at all of the various conquests. I mean, if you look at the effect on the Inuit people in Greenland, if you look at all the Native Americans in North America, if you look at the Aborigines in Australia, I'm sure everywhere, again, it's the same story. When there is such a discrepancy between the invaders and the indigenous, even though it might take a couple of centuries for the indigenous to basically be wiped out or to be reduced in numbers to such an extent that there's nothing effectively left, even though it takes a long time for it to play out, the fact is when you have a sufficient discrepancy, it's a foregone conclusion. So as soon as the settlers, I would say, as soon as they started overflowing the Appalachian Mountains in the U.S., the fate of the indigenous people there was decided. I mean, it still could have been in play. I mean, the fact that they came in on the east coast of North America and pushed the natives out, there was still a lot of negotiation, and the power disparity was not as great. But by the time the Europeans had a beachhead, so to speak, up to the Appalachians, and industry was forming, and, you know, after that it was done. It was done for the natives. Now, it could be that the reason why we have theater in the sky now is because the extraterrestrials are inviting us to develop ways to cope with them. In other words, if the European settlers in North America had really drastically restricted their numbers and the type of contact and dragged it out over centuries, it might have provoked an observable response in the natives so that they kind of rose to the challenge and changed their governmental forms and maybe innovated some of their own technology. And, you know, they were kind of encouraged. They weren't flattened, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
That they might have become more viable and rose to the challenge. Maybe that's what we're seeing now.
Yeah, we do. And we do have a good historical example of where the natives did respond, and that was with the Meiji Restoration in Japan. That is very much a case of where a less developed civilization recognized its inadequacies and responded according to a desire to survive and thrive in a context that came to recognize where it was at the start grossly disadvantaged technologically and militarily, and set about reforming itself root and branch in order to cope with that new condition. I've often thought, for what it's worth, that very much is a useful historical parallel at this point in time.
It's interesting. You know, I've had occasion to think about this recently and to consider more what it's like to be one of these indigenous groups that are run over. And, you know, if you look at municipal government in the U.S., it is a phenomenon where a lot of inner cities, major cities, are actually governed by African American people, not just in the position of mayor, but the entire city government. And again and again and again, these cities are failed governments, whether it's Philadelphia, Detroit, and so on. The corruption is rampant, it's overt. And if you jettison the whole bullshit racial argument, whether it's this, that, the other thing, what seems obvious to me is that the people, the black cultures in these cities that hold power in the city government, consider all of the institutional forms of the government that they manage to be basically bullshit. It's all bullshit. And to me, now this makes a certain amount of sense, because if you are a colonized people, and even if you acquire power, but you have to inhabit this institutional framework which you did not devise, and which is basically alien to you, because if given the chance to start from scratch, you would devise something totally different, then you never consider it to be your own. I mean, you never say, oh, these are our institutions.
Right.
You just use them instrumentally for what they're worth.
And, you know, we can save ourselves from the racial discomfort here by just considering the Greek example, which is exactly that. Greece is a spectacularly misgoverned nation because historically the Greeks inherited governmental forms from the Turks, which they popularly never embraced. As you said, to them it's bullshit. So it's just corruption and racketeering up and down. And so, you find in most accounts today of the conflict between the Troika and the Greek government, you have sort of a very outdated romantic respect for the leftist government of Greece, and they're speaking against austerity and for solidarity and this kind of thing. But when you actually look into it, it's just the Greek government it's not a government at all. It's just a racket, and it's now that the racketeers, they've absolutely no interest at all in trying to transform this into any sort of reasonably organized government, because fundamentally, as you said, they're a colonized people through and through. Who curiously, even when they do secure some level of power, end up despoiling that which they claim to serve.
Well, you see it again and again. In Greenland, for example, I was surprised to learn that you have this sizable Inuit population, and it's the same story as everywhere else. You've got massive suicide rate.
Yeah.
You've got
drugs.
Oh, sure. Something like 40 or 50% of the high school students don't graduate high school. Nothing but despair and deprivation. Now, though, I mean, Inuits are in charge of government, and the situation does not improve. If anything, you can say in different areas it's worsened. And it invites the bigoted response, oh, well, that's just how those people are. Well, no. The fact is that they have inherited this alien political, social framework, which, because it's alien, they naturally, in a very recognizable human way, they resent it. They think it's bullshit. They see it only for basically what it is. It confers wealth on a few, so those who get into positions of power, that's how they use it. They don't give a shit. They've got nothing invested in the abstract success of these institutions.
Right. And again, I know that the vast majority of such instances are of people colonized by Europeans. But you can think, I mentioned the Greeks. You could also mention the Irish. They did exactly the same thing. They inherited a whole set of British institutions. There was no Irish Revolution. They just managed to change the figureheads at the top. But of course, the people as a whole and the government carried on as if they are, colonized peoples trying to secure advantage through, raw cunning and corruption and the like, and which of course leads to very ineffective government and wasteful and useless administration. And collectively the people are just scarred by cynicism, and so you end up with something like Ireland and Greece, which have been historically two peripheral economies within Europe, but two undeveloped nations, and two nations essentially incapable of development for large parts of their history.
Well, I think if you consider what we're discussing here, you quickly come to the conclusion that it totally and forever refutes this Greer-like scenario of joining a galactic brotherhood. We know simply from different cultures on Earth that they can be totally alien. And it's not a question of interpretation or intellectual flexibility. The fact is, if a group of people, a population like the Inuit or the Native Americans or any of the examples we've discussed, if their basic biological viability is diminished and significantly diminished by having to use these foreign, alien cultural frameworks from simply other groups of human beings. I mean, if the fact is that among the Inuit in Greenland, you have an epidemic of suicide, and you've got alcoholism, drug use, and it's a basic disaster, this is a very dangerous situation biologically for the population. And this is simply a function of the fact that they are forced to accept these institutions that come from other cultures that are foreign and alien to them. Now, what would happen to the human species Because the fact is, I think, undeniable, using the principle of analogy, that if all of a sudden we became aware of what this galactic brotherhood was like, this galactic federation, its forms would be mostly, if not completely, utterly alien. And yet, the power and the viability of their civilizations would be undeniable. We would feel threatened. And if we were forced to associate, if we are suddenly absorbed, if suddenly we became a part of their thing, on a worldwide scale, we might become kind of like the Inuit. We'd be totally disenfranchised. Our destinies, our futures would be, the whole question would be taken off the table because there would be no more question of a future for us. Our future would be them.
And in the ramifications, I mean, you just spill on from that. If you even think of what are the impacts narrowly and individually, we're exposed to an extraterrestrial culture, and for what I think would be especially catastrophic if we were exposed to one of these human-like extraterrestrial groups. They're genetically and biologically, they're very similar to us. And we see, and of course, as you say, in all likelihood, they would be extraordinarily and undeniably more advanced than we. But what we'd probably find is that we would then learn of their culture and personal culture. What we would find in that is a personal demand we couldn't respond to. So every day we'd wake up, in a way, we know what we must do, but we can't do it. So there's probably demands for, intellectual and spiritual development in certain ways, but we're just not able to meet those disciplines. And so what emerges in that? Well, all sorts of problems arise. You've obviously an issue of self-contempt, and then in that obviously will evolve itself to the point of rejecting that standard which you felt has been imposed. So if you do have this exposure to such a civilization, it would in time, you think, it would generate an almost militaristic response without anyone ever intending it. But it becomes that rejection, which you would need to have just for some measure of self-respect, at least, would manifest itself on the aggregate, and obviously injure the nature of the relationships between us and this group to the point where I think we could well move towards outright conflict.
Even more than that, I would say that the feelings of frustration, to put it mildly, would mean an orgy of violence. I think if all of a sudden, disclosure happened, not necessarily by, benign fathers in the government telling us, but let's say they just showed up in our skies in an overt, undeniable way and so on. I think the human response, if we had the sense that our destiny was no longer open, would just be an explosion, an orgy of violence. Militaristically, we might try to develop weapons, we say, to combat them, but I don't think there'd be any chance we could bridge that gap at all. So really, ultimately, what would end up happening is that humans would start killing each other in record numbers. You'd have national security states exploding, supposedly in order to meet the alien menace. Obviously, they can't meet that menace because they're just savages waving their sticks in the air. So really, the function will be to not only oppress, but to make war against native populations, because we have to make war. It's like that earthworm that you're, stabbing with a knife, the squirming becomes frantic, and that would be the human species in its death throes. So here again, we have a scenario where disclosure is in question. I suspect for there to be any kind of overt confirmation of alien presence, the human species has to reach a point where it is able to simultaneously believe that its destiny is open somehow. For example, if we developed a kind of space travel on our own, where basically we discovered or came to believe that creation was our oyster, that we could go anywhere. If we felt that in our bones and then became exposed to this greater extraterrestrial presence, we might be able to still eke out a kind of self-dignity and chance for survival, because we might think on a deep level, well, we can still fill up the cosmos and go see new things on our own. But if the alien presence becomes an undeniable fact while we're still stuck here, maybe you would have this orgy of self-destruction.
So really you're looking at a global Judenrat.
Say it again.
You would have a Judenrat, like the Jewish governments in the ghettos.
I'm not sure of the expression.
The Nazis forced the Jews, where they found them, to organize themselves, to form ghetto councils, the Judenrat. And they would, in one of the darker chapters of the Holocaust, it's that these governments would often be as savage as the Nazis themselves, believing that their survival depended upon appeasing Nazi desires. Now, what happened across Europe was, very, very tragically, is that the Jews believed the Nazis were materially motivated. So they thought it was just simply a matter of riding out the storm. They thought if they simply acceded to Nazi wishes, they would survive. So when the Nazis would, this was especially true in Eastern Europe, the Nazis would have the Jews themselves organize the Jewish population. That they themselves would organize themselves in the ghetto and police themselves. They would find the people for the trains themselves, thinking that when the Nazis said, look, there were production facilities in the East, the Judenrat believed this to be the case. Yeah, well, of course. Why would the Nazis kill us if they're going to use us in factories? And so it reached there's a very, very, very low point is where, God, I can't quite recall where it was, but there was finally the Nazis convinced a Judenrat to organize a roundup of children. And the head of the Judenrat spoke in front of the remaining Jewish population and said, give me your children. But that happened. But in terms of human governance, this is one of the darkest and chapters you can imagine.
Well, I think that you've stumbled upon it. I think you've nailed it. I think that is, in essence, everything we see today. We were talking in an earlier conversation about the conspiracy. We're talking about those in the know on the inside who are contending with the UFO issue. I think you've just established the basic formula. What are we seeing world historically around us? The total consolidation of power, the contempt for populations, militarism, total surveillance, the prison planet scenario. I think you're seeing that now, this Judenrat, you're seeing it now in its initial moments. That's precisely what's happening. And you could say that this is the stupidity of humanity writ large, that you have these unknown alien outsiders who are being regarded the same way that the Jewish elites were regarding the Nazis. Give them what they want. Yeah. They want a humanity speaking with one unified voice. Well, the only way we can do that is if we exterminate millions and have worldwide wars and, a totally top-down, oppressive control state society. Well, I think what better explanation for everything we see is there?
Yeah, and again, there are obviously very compelling explanations or very compelling narratives from the powers that be to convince the new governments of every single power in the world to agree to the secrecy. So everywhere, France, Italy, Russia, China, North Korea, South Korea, they were able to convince every single leadership not to make some sort of open public disclosure.
Well, I think that there is a sort of basic historical reason for that. that in its own way is a kind of historical tragedy. I think that the reason why a country like the United States can get away with doing what you just described, convincing all of these other countries in the world to be on board with this program, such as it is, I think ultimately what it reawakens is this historical experience of the divine right of kings. Now, this doctrine of the divine right of kings was implicit and explicit here and there in different places throughout history, and then I think it became most explicit with the French monarchy. But the idea that there is something mystical or supernatural behind political power that is ultimately the basis for political power. This is something that was either rightly or wrongly believed for thousands of years, most of human civilizational history, from the very beginning. So now, if after a very brief interlude of perhaps less than a century, 2 centuries at most, of secular political power, imperfectly achieved, ideas of popular sovereignty, if through the back door now, all of a sudden, you have United States covert government saying to another government, listen, here we have this alien technology, we have this happen, this happen, this happen. What does all that amount to? It amounts to ultimately a supernatural basis for political power. Because why would a country like Denmark refuse to go along with a country like the United States if the United States covert depths convey to Denmark's covert depths that, well, we have this alien menace and they're all powerful, there's telepathy involved, there's mind control. It's the same old story all over again. So I could see 100 nations around the globe all working and agreeing in concert for this reason, because without knowing it, they're being motivated by the same old thing, the idea that there is a supernatural or otherworldly basis for political power. And of course you go along. So if the Americans say, well, you have to do this because we've got all this otherworldly shit going on, and we control some of it, we have access to it, then of course you will.
Of course, in particular, if the individuals concerned are either threatened directly or bribed directly. As has been pointed out with Tony Blair. Tony Blair was worth, I think it was £20 million sterling within 12 months of leaving office. And it's the point Paul Craig Roberts raised before. I'm sure I mentioned it. He once asked someone in the know, quote unquote, is how do you control Europe? Easy. We just buy them off, was the answer. And, there's the secret government. Yeah, it's reasonably well established. They've fantastic access to any amount of wealth that they need. But, to just go back a couple of points. I remember once you mentioned somebody had gotten the idea that the current wars in the Middle East were creating structures which were useful to the planet for purposes which cannot yet be seen. Do you remember this?
Sure, it was an interview that Marla Fries did with Whitley Strieber following some sort of psychic experience she had, in which she gave she received what she felt was a very surprising answer or explanation regarding the wars in the Middle East. She was shown an image of something like a fence in the sand, and it was hard to visualize exactly what she meant. But the way she interpreted it and described it was to say that these wars are going to create a structure, because when the world collapses without that structure, the Middle East would become a quicksand. I think that was her actual word.
Well, just on that, can we just take a minute?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's just notice how fucking cold it's getting here. Uh, the nature is when you the big open skies, of course, is the temperature just drops like a fucking rock when the sun goes down. And an interesting thing about Australia is more Australians die of cold than Swedes do. Um, because in Australia, nothing's built properly. You don't need to build properly. You can get away with shitty construction. And so yeah, you fucking freeze in this country. A lot of Europeans say that. They say they've never been so cold as they have been in Australia. Yeah, it's just pretty cool. But that's very interesting what you said about Marla Frees. What she got was this idea, yeah, that these was that basically it? Was that what she said? Did she elaborate? Did she?
No, I think that was basically it.
Yeah, okay.
Well, this is the standard story with imperialism. I mean, the empire, whatever it is, goes in and creates a structure, such as it is. I think the implication from what she said, at least this was the implication I got. It's been some time since I heard the actual audio. But the implication was that when the world reaches something like environmental collapse and, you have mass famine and so on, that's the reason for this quote-unquote framework. In other words, it's better to have, these populations that are in some way being directed by this awful, oppressive imperialist framework than no framework at all when, the end comes.
Well, okay. I mean, it makes sense in that modern agriculture has been described as a means of transforming petroleum into food, and there are any number of scenarios you can imagine where there's obviously need to zealously safeguard that petroleum production in the Middle East, despite the successes of fracking here and there, which, after all, we're told will be short-lived.
Well, I, after resisting for many, many years, within the past couple of months, I broke down and I listened to a lot of audio by Terence McKenna. And I always regarded him just as a drug enthusiast and evangelist. And the fact that he's held in such high regard by these, wannabe nouveau counterculturalists, to me meant that everything he said was basically useless. But, my personal habit is to listen to podcast audio every night as I go to sleep, because it keeps me from thinking my own thoughts and allows me to drift off to sleep. And so, running out of things to listen to, I said, what the hell? I'll try to adjust my expectations, lower my standards. And I came away with a less negative opinion of him. I regard him as a kind of popular philosopher. He's philosophizing within a tradition that is rooted in popular experience, which is fine. And he has his own limitations. For example, whenever you hear him talk shit about, Derrida or deconstruction, you can kind of intuit that that's because he can't grasp it. Like he just can't get it. So he finds it to be useless and then dislikes it. But there are a number of things that he said in these audios that I listened to were things that I had come to or felt independently. And since, like any egotist, I value my own thoughts, the fact that he was repeating things that I had thought, made me think, oh, his thoughts are valuable too. Well, one of the things that he said that was something that I had sort of recently formulated myself was that we are victims of history. I think the way he put it was that history is something that happens to us. And I really favor that expression when it comes to people who think a priori that there is value in political activism. People who never doubt that we have some sort of relationship to our own destiny, that it can be achieved politically, no matter how difficult it is. Now, I'm not saying that this is a conclusion that should be embraced to the exclusion of all others, but like I have said in the past, that, it's important at different times and places for there to be a counterthrust, for there to be balance in one's thinking. You have to formulate the counterthrust. And this idea that we are victims of history, that history is something that happens to us, is like a necessary injection of skepticism in the purest sense into the thinking of people in large. Skepticism originally in Western philosophy was not the idea that everything that could be doubted, or that certain things needed to be doubted, or that there was a default stance you would take, one of skeptical doubt. No, it was more the view that nothing could be known. Nothing could be known. Now they qualify that and they say, it was really that nothing could be known absolutely. Well, however you want to try to parse it, this very radical idea that nothing can be known, that's a major departure from the everyday notion that obviously things can be known. It's the same thing with his view that history is something that happens to us, that we don't have any control over it, that we're victims of it in a way. And I see it precisely that way. I mean, look what we're talking about. Suppose that this scenario is real and that it's in play, that secretly behind the scenes at very deep levels that we scarcely catch a whiff of, the world is moving into precisely the structure you described, the Judenrat or the Judenrat, which I'll have to research. And what does that mean? We don't have any fucking control over it at all. We can't go out and protest. We can't change things at the voting booth. All of these absurd rituals, the idea of political participation, having some sort of distant, nonlinear, that's just pure faith. That's if anything, it's superstition.
So what it is, though, it in a way it's worse than that, because the mass of humanity find themselves in the middle of a ghetto so large that they can't even see the surrounding wire. You think how much, if you'd actually see, maybe if we're to construe the world that it's ultimately under a certain control, for the vast majority of human beings, their considerations are within a framework which excludes that actuality. Even just to use the visual metaphor, they're in the middle of a ghetto and they don't even know there's an edge to the ghetto.
Yeah, but then also consider the plight of people like us. Let's suppose that what we're discussing has reality, and what are we supposed to do? Like what are our responsibilities? Well, this idea that you can somehow actively manage or direct history may itself be totally false, in which case you are a victim of history. This is the world we're condemned to live in, not the world of 2,000 years ago, not the world of 2,000 years from now. We're just condemned. It's the moment when alienation is complete, not simply having like a negative relation to the world around you, but having a non-relation, where in the end you are totally separated finally from this history that's unfolding around you. Because I think if you believe that, if you believe the classic model that you should engage and try to change your political circumstance and all that sort of thing, you are trying to affect a relation between yourself and the political, yourself and the historical. And so, at first you have to believe that there is a relation. And alienation, in the general sense, is the feeling that there's a relation, but it's a negative one. What I'm saying is that ultimately there's a non-relation. If you entertain fully this idea that we are victims of history is something that happens to us, in a way you have jettisoned this notion of there being a relation in the first place, that whatever's going to happen is something that will happen no matter what. Like if I'm in a rushing river and there's a torrential flood and I'm being washed downstream, how absurd would it be for me to think that I could affect the movement of this set of waves or currents, and that those will in turn affect other currents, and maybe the river will change direction and I'll be deposited safely on shore. Who the fuck would think that when you're being washed away? You would be well aware of the reality of the situation, which is you have no control over the direction of the river, the power of the waves, the velocity of your movement. You're simply being swept away, and where you end up is something that you never for a moment wishfully think that you could change in any real way.
Sure. And the people who may be most acutely aware of that are the people we would take to be the most powerful in the world. Someone like Barack Obama may be the first to completely agree with you there. In his biography, in his early life, he seems to be someone who really does hold to a radical progressive politics. But yet, his administration is a good distance from anything that could be considered progressive. Now, if you could speak to him and get him to speak honestly, he may tell you exactly, he may articulate it as you just did, is that he's just simply overwhelmed by forces. He himself, the most powerful man in the world, we think, is a victim of history.
It's very funny that you bring this up, because I've been thinking more and more lately. It's an idea I've had for a while, but I've been thinking more and more lately about writing a book called The President and modeling it on The Prince by Machiavelli and anglicizing Machiavelli's name, but writing it in a way that mirrors The Prince without ever referring to it, as a kind of guidebook for the president, and describing all of these realities as if they are transparently observable facts, the way that the president has no power, where he has power, and so on, and talking about things like the UFO issue and writing it in an absolutely factual way, as if from the point of view of a political insider, as a handbook for the president, as if here's the handbook that you get as the president when you take office. You observe these things. I think each personality that occupies the position handles it differently. If you look at Jimmy Carter, for example, he's an interesting case. Whenever you see group photos of Carter with other presidents, there's a pretty famous one, I think, that was taken in the Oval Office after Obama became president, was sworn in. The body language is quite revealing, in my opinion. I've never heard anybody else comment on it. You've got Carter standing off to the side trying to maintain a distance from all of the others, as if he's absolutely reluctant to be there, and he wants to distance himself from them. He's not standing toward the front saying he's the most important president. He's standing almost behind in a way, like he doesn't want to be with the others. And then if you look at his humanitarian work post-presidency, I feel that there's a lot of atonement in everything that he's done. Here's a guy who, rather than going around making countless millions, I'm sure he's not destitute, but he has spent decades building houses for poor people. Now, that's very different than anything a Reagan or a Bush or a Clinton or Obama have done. And when you combine that with the story, supposedly, and you don't know if it's accurate or not, but the idea that Carter went in there and tried to get information about the UFO issue, was told by H.W. Bush, CIA director, he didn't have need to know. And another variation of the story that Carter was emotionally shaken and in tears about it. Here's a guy who may well feel like, having been president, that he's got blood on his hands, and that, there's this great tragedy that he can't even speak of, a world historical tragedy. So what does he do? He devotes himself to building houses for poor people for the rest of his life. Penance, you know?
Yeah. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting set of observations. Carter also was on record as saying he saw a UFO.
Well, that's right.
He,
And
you
if
know,
you listen, there's a... Go ahead.
no, go.
Well, there was a classic recording of Carter long before he became president. I think he was speaking to the Bar Association of Georgia or something like that, a group of lawyers. And he was pretty fiercely politically progressive, and it was quite impressive to listen to him. It was the speech that caused Hunter S. Thompson back in the 70s to say, you know, this guy ought to be president. So he had similar progressive credentials. He was talking to these lawyers about equal rights and the race issue and so on. And he had a very kind of fiercely pro-social justice point of view that sounded sincere. It wasn't the usual dogma, talking point bullshit. But I think each individual personality reacts differently. And I think someone like an Obama, you can see is not someone with a good character, because you have the anecdotes coming out about Obama making kind of sadistic sounding jokes about droning people. And I think that he is a different kind of case where you become president, maybe you think you have all of these beliefs, and you discover that essentially you're a functionary, that you have no power at all. So what do you do at that point? I think some people compensate by identifying to some extent with the sadistic role into which they've been placed. So if Obama is given no choice but to invade countries and to engage in political assassinations and to do all of this horrible stuff and to drone people, to drone 16-year-olds, he's not able to close Guantanamo. What does he do in order to maintain his sense of ego and not to be totally crushed? Well, to some extent, he identifies with the power that he does have. So if he's given a piece of paper with a list of names and he's told, Mr. President, sign this because we're going to drone them, he decides, okay, I'm doing it voluntarily. I can drone motherfuckers, and he signs it, you know. And there are other examples that you could read about Obama's presidency that are similar. Some of the remarks that he makes and the jokes and the snide comments and so on.
Well, Robert Reich, who is Clinton's first Secretary of Treasury, he has told a story how he had to explain to Clinton that his spending plans weren't feasible because of the relationship between deficit spending and interest rates. And so Reich tells a story where he explained to Clinton some economics 101 that if you deficit spend, you'll have to borrow. If you borrow, you drive up interest rates. If you drive up interest rates, you'll compound the recession, which will defeat your spending plans. And so Clinton, as Reich tells his story, Clinton was exasperated. And he said words to the effect of, you mean my administration is beholden to a bunch of bondholders? What I found very interesting about that story is that you've someone who's managed to climb to the very summit of power in the world. He's up there, he's there. He's now president of the United States. But he is fundamentally ignorant of the nature of power in the world. It seems a strange time to learn about bond markets and interest rates when you get to the very top. And now you learn, well, you mean I can't actually do these things. And Reich, to his credit, is very progressive. He's a very progressive political figure. And he himself understands that, yeah, they act in a world where their better natures, if you like, are constrained by harsh realities. And for Clinton, it was an enormous discovery, and he felt constrained by it. So his progressive program for his country was blocked by an economic framework he didn't even understand before he walked in. And so you can imagine that on top of that, there are other frameworks to the extraterrestrials and aliens and other geopolitical realities we know nothing about. You don't know. I mean, something that's been mentioned by Stephen Greer is dead man fusing, which is that there are nuclear weapons already in place in various cities. So Obama may have all sorts of plans for, dealing with Iran, but there are certain realities, and he knows that Iran has maybe bombs in position already. And I see that's an enormously large part of a reality that's revealed the moment he walks in the door.
Well, that's the great joke. The great joke and the tragedy of the American presidency is that every 4 years or every 8 years, some new fresh meat comes in, some rube who's just fallen off the turnip truck. And without exception, he thinks that he's bought into the baloney that the president is the most powerful man in the world. And of course, this baloney functions out there in order to make people think that presidential elections matter, and it functions to make the American public think that really only the presidential election matters, and therefore they don't have to worry so much about congressmen. Although, if you look at the original federal model, the legislative branch is supposed to be the most powerful, but I mean, that's an extinct idea now. But every 4 or 8 years, some new idiot comes in who is ego-driven. He's in love with his own self-image. This is why he's a successful politician. And it's an outright discovery, to say the least, that he doesn't have all the power that he wants. In fact, it's even worse, because I think the first lesson of any president today is that he has no power. I think that's explained to him, taught to him, demonstrated very early.
I think you're right.
And when you consider now these all-powerful secret, exactly. I mean, I think anyone with any shred of intelligence who achieves the office of president of the United States is going to immediately realize that not only does he have no power, but he's totally under the control of others who can discredit him, assassinate him at any time.
I see. That's exactly it. As you were talking, I was imagining the sheer dramatic power of that moment. That he walks in. He's immediate office administration organization is something that's imposed on him. Even day one, just even in how he's actually working, is that he's faced with an agenda he didn't write. He has to meet people he doesn't know. I'm fucking sure there's a moment where he's sitting in an office with a guy who doesn't even identify himself. And moreover, I'm sure these agencies pull the stunt of sending in some flunky, some junior, some guy in his fucking 30s sitting in front of him. And he says, look, he probably just to rub it in, he probably calls him by his first name. Barack, look, we've got this file we want to show you. And he just throws it across the table. And it's every crime and misdemeanor. And Obama looks through it, and of course he panics, and you can imagine all the full range of human emotion. He says, and then he demands, "Who are you? Who are you?" And the guy just bursts out laughing and walks out the door. So he goes to bed. He's gone through any number of briefings after that, but he goes to bed that night going, "Who the fuck was that guy?" And then he tries to inquire. He gets his director of the National Security Agency and said, I met some guy, and then it's put in vague terms, oh yeah, well, there's an organization, and he's just dealing with shadows, but he knows in those shadows from time to time give way to very menacing form, like he saw on that first day. He saw he's known bottom to top, or even he could just get some sort of, you can imagine just how it would be done. There's a file on him, and then there's a file, say, on Paul. Was it Paul Wellstone, the senator who died in the plane crash?
Sure.
You can imagine just the appendix includes a report on what happened. There was a bomb on board, and the explosive was traced to a U.S. military installation. That's what you have to do. Or even worse, even if you're more ruthless, he threatened his children and his wife.
Oh, I take
Yeah,
that to be, I take it to be certain. Well, it
sure.
was Bill Hicks, wasn't it, the comedian who joked that, the first thing that happens when a new president is sworn in is that he's ushered into a small room and he's shown the Zapruder film.
Yeah.
And then, he's asked at the end of it, any questions? And
Yeah.
that probably represents in some form what actually happens. And I think that there's plenty of evidence to suppose this is the case. Look at the way the presidency, in case after case, look at the way the presidency manifests itself. In Obama's case, you have around Obama right now a core group of loyalists from Chicago, where he's from. And if you look at George W. Bush, he had around him a core group of people from Texas, where he was from. In every case, the president comes in and they choose these people who you would think would give him a handicap because they don't have national political experience. If I'm choosing my friend here from Chicago, my friend here from Chicago, and I'm putting them in the absolute top positions in my administration, the fact that they have not had those positions before, that they have not engaged in national politics, you would think would be a no-no. But no. Again and again, these presidents do it out of necessity. Why? Because they know everyone's against them. And the only people who have a chance of remaining loyal are these people who they bring up from the local level who might have bonds of loyalty for that reason.
Sure.
So even though these people might be deficient in ability and experience, and the president might suffer as a result, it's better to have them, who might be blindly loyal, than all these other assholes in Washington.
But that goes all the way back to Kennedy. Didn't Kennedy have a clique from Boston around him, and Nixon
Well, Bobby Kennedy brought in his brother, for Christ's sake, to be Attorney General, and he was his closest advisor. So you've got a filial bond. But sure, it's that type of thing again and again and again. And why is that? Because they know, given the nature of power, that when you come in, all of these positions that are held by people, these positions that you don't choose. I mean, you cannot go in as a president and clean out the entire federal government and staff it entirely with your own groups. At best, what happens in Washington is the very top level positions in federal agencies are given away to political supporters as returns for campaign assistance. So, for example, Bush's federal disaster czar, this guy who was nicknamed Brown, the idiot who was in charge when Katrina happened. Why did he have that position? He had no background in disaster management or anything like that. It was a political payment for either the guy directly for rendering assistance during the campaign or the people who knew the guy. So you staff all these top level, the giveaways, all the top level positions, almost
every ambassador.
Positions. Yeah. But that means that the entire structure underneath is basically self-governing. So all these federal agencies are all manned by insiders and basically controlled by insiders. You might choose the head of the Housing and Urban Development Department. You might put in the head as a political appointee. But who's really running the show? The next 2 or 3 or 6 or 8 levels of management who've been there for 20 or 30 years.
Sure. Yep.
They're the ones who know where all the bodies are buried.
And they have their own culture. They have a sense of how things should be done. They have an absolute contempt for the political appointee. They set the agenda. They dominate her or him. They drive her or him. Yeah, for sure. And you can imagine too, I think that this would be especially acute in dealing with the military. And you can imagine all the little stunts that would be pulled. Like Obama comes over with 2 or 3 advisors for a conference. He walks in the room. There's like fucking 200 officers there. You can imagine every sort of psychological stunt and game, and deliberately speaking in acronyms where he has no fucking idea what's going on. He has no idea. But then to flatter him and present with options to give him, and so we conclude, really, our options are A or B. What do you think, sir? Well, I think B. Well, you sure? Okay. You know, it's you can just imagine how it's done. And I can imagine if you came into that role, how rattled you'd be within a few days. Like fucking rattled. Like you would have to think, I'm so far out of my depth here. I don't want to be here. I feel
Sure,
threatened.
especially if you're
Yeah.
just a media figure, if you're somebody who thinks that your own self, I mean, if you believe the bullshit adoration you get from the public and you go in there with a stupid conception that the president has power, you know, uh, imagine that discovery, because you suddenly realize how much of a schmuck you really are. You've got
Sure,
no
yeah.
power at all. Yeah. This has always been the case. Uh, and you can look at it from so many different levels. Fletcher Prouty described how the CIA, as early as the 50s, had a whole system set up where they had CIA personnel at fairly high levels of management in all the federal agencies who, their positions would never be threatened. And most of the time, they were simply agency employees. But whenever the CIA needed information or the CIA wanted something done a certain way in that agency, it fell to that person or those people to steer the direction of the agency and to get it done. So, as early as the 50s, you had a clandestine agency, the CIA, infiltrating from the inside all of the more public federal agencies. Without exception, he described that being done. So, you've got that aspect. You've got the selective presentation of data to the executive branch, to the presidency. How does the president get any information? Say the president says, well, I need the budget. What guarantees does he have he's going to get an accurate budget? He says, I need to know how many troops are here or there. Who's to say he's going to get an accurate figure?
Sure.
Kennedy discovered early on that the information the CIA was feeding him in all sorts of ways was total bullshit. So he eventually cut out the CIA. And that was, of course, I think one of the things that led to him getting killed. But you can't trust any of the information you get. These briefing officers who come in, what are they telling you? What reason do you suppose that the briefing officer has to give you accurate information? Just because you're president? Bullshit. So this is kind of what I was getting at before in previous conversation when I was talking about the reality leading you to a state of total terror. Basically, paranoia as a default mode if you are a high political official who isn't completely retarded. If you are Obama and you have any intelligence, you're going to doubt every single thing that you're told, everything that you're shown. And of course, you can't breathe a word of it because it can only sound like total paranoia. If you know that the Defense Department, the CIA, they've got access to all of these technologies, I'm not necessarily saying extraterrestrial, but you will get some glimpse of it, I'm sure, if you are the commander in chief, quote unquote, and the military wants to come in and impress you and say, oh, well, we're deploying such and such equipment and the public doesn't know about it, or we're engaged in this or that assassination enterprise, you're going to suspect and therefore believe that they have all sorts of means that could be directed against you at any time.
Oh, yeah.
So sure, I mean, if you're the president and you have any intelligence, you might fear being given all of a sudden some form of exotic cancer, which has been done to
Congressman
politics.
Schiff.
Sure.
Yeah.
You might doubt anything. Your family could be killed. You could be discredited. They could be killed as well. I don't think there's anybody in power with any sense who doesn't ultimately suspect the obvious when it comes to the Kennedy assassinations. I mean, come on, you've got so many different assassinations involving the Kennedys and so on. So that's all, I think that's been an object lesson for years. It's like an unspoken, unwritten, but universally understood fact that assassination is on the table. And worse, probably.
I mean, the cynicism is something else in one way. You think that with Barack Obama, in a way, he's perfectly positioned to manage some of the great economic decline that we've seen. As an African American, he can give credence to the line maybe that the Black American population enjoy any actual emancipation, even though they've gone through a recession where they've seen, net wealth per household decimated, experiencing all forms of brutality, incarceration rates, and no meaningful reform of the system to, in a progressive direction, help the poorest people. And all the while, you have a black president there, which I'm sure, in and of itself, dissipates so much, an enormous amount of agitation that would have occurred if you had a white president.
Yes, isn't it perfect? I mean, years ago when I cared more, I absolutely despised that fact. I said, all of you idiots who supported Obama and thought it was going to be this earth-shaking, wonderful return to humanity and so on. I mean, and you've learned nothing. And to a man, all of these socially left-leaning political commentators, whether it's a Jon Stewart or a Charlie Brooker in the UK, Mr. Cynical, and so on, all of these assholes, to a man, at bottom, just adored Obama and assumed with a maximum amount of stupidity that political change was inevitable. The opposite has been shown to be the case, and yet they haven't drawn any conclusions from the fact. Only the more militant people on the left have drawn the proper conclusions, which is to say you have this giant self-sustaining system. The president is always a puppet. But these people are derided by the more mainstream liberal left who just, they just don't care. Obama said he'd close Guantanamo, didn't. I mean, didn't deliver on a single campaign promise. He came in with the popularity of Jesus Christ. There were even right-leaning political people who, without wanting to admit it, were profoundly sympathetic to Obama because even they had been touched by this grand mythic narrative of racial progress, social improvement, and so on. So I think if Obama had been someone of substance and if the power structure were slightly different, he would have been an enormously successful president. But in fact, he's been shown to be a complete lightweight. He's achieved nothing. And he's only sort of cynically identified with his role as drone killer and made comments and so on. So what can be said? But this is the modern American presidency, which no one wants to admit or recognize.